listeners. Thank you for coming back for another episode of Lit Happens. As always, I'm joined by our co-host Adrielle. Today's episode is the language that separates good essays from great ones. We want to talk about the HSC verbs today, just doubling up with all the content we've put up on the trials recently and prepping for HSC. We thought this would be a really great place to start. So, Adrielle, how are you traveling this week with this episode?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Bill. Good, thanks, Bill. It's
Probably in the middle of trial marking.
in the middle of trial marking, but it's always busy in the school year. But these are the joys. I think it's one of those things that you get to it, you get to this period of the year, and you're just like, man, I'm chasing my tail. I'm chasing my tail, and then it's like you put into perspective, why is this any different to any other time of the year? Because teaching is busy. It's the same story in every season, I guess. So
Yeah.
look, nothing new. Still going along with the swing of things, and excited to delve into a little bit of this essay writing, which I think will be beneficial both for our teachers and for our students that may be listening. I think it's just a bit of a refresher tonight, today.
Yeah.
There we go. That's actually where my brain's at.
Yeah. Oh, you're
um,
tired from marking.
this is
Yeah.
this is correct. But no, it'll be good. It'll be good to delve into it, and I think it's also going to be beneficial for people who are just looking at different ways in approaching essay writing in general. To be honest, like I know there may be
Mm,
people from other places thinking, "Hey, how is this going to be beneficial for university style essays?" And remember, essay writing is a skill in general. So
yeah.
when we think of this, it's going to be a useful skill for all listeners, hopefully. So really looking forward to
Yeah.
explaining a few of these things and explaining the nuances in some of the verbiage that we may receive in marking criterias and guidelines. But yeah,
Yeah.
busy, always busy.
Perfect. Always busy. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They're so important, the HSC verbs, and not just for English teachers, but teachers of the other HSC KLAs would also be nodding their head, going, "Yeah, they're really important," because it's the difference between just writing something that's clear and
Yeah.
good or competent, but the difference between making it actually hit the mark and making sure, for English at least, it's as persuasive and high scoring as possible. But those
Mm,
specific
mm,
words, verb choices are really important. They
yeah.
uh, point you towards the depth and the way that you need to respond to the question. So it's
Yeah.
always important that students know them. Like, I know you and I are really big on even rote learning them, know them like
Yeah.
the back of
Yeah.
your hand. And then how do we apply that in specific KLA? So I think this episode is
Mm,
going to be
mm,
really, really useful for anyone who's aiming for a band 6, or
yeah.
trying to push their students toward that, or they just want to write with more precision and more impact. So I think we'll get into that then, Adriel, with our very
Yeah.
first question for today. So we want to look at, well, what do the HSC key verbs actually require from the students, and why do so many responses stay at the effective level as opposed to
Yeah.
the sophisticated
Yeah.
level? Because I
Or
think you're
highly
right,
effective.
like, exactly, because I think
Yeah.
that's a really, really good part of that question, because a student might be addressing it, but it might not be precise or nuanced enough to get them into that top band, which is what they're mostly aiming for. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, look, the verbiage may change as well, and we're just using this verb effective. I know and understand that there has been a little bit of a shift in terms of, this idea of effective, maybe even competent. So just keep an eye out on that in terms of some of the marking criterions that are coming out. But I think when we look at the verbs themselves, this is probably one of the most common places HSC students will plateau in terms of their responses. So they might remain
Mm,
at a certain band level, and they might be like, "Well, how come I don't continue to improve and move forward
mm,
into those upper echelons when it comes to our writing?" And again, this is relevant not only for English; it's relevant for any of the other subjects. And you're moving into a tertiary education later on, this may be something to consider as well for people that are trying to develop essays in university. But what we see is most students can probably define those main Nessa verbs that we do see coming across. So they know how to analyze, which means to break something down. They know how evaluate means to make a judgment. They might look at the
mhm,
word assess, which means to weigh up the significance of something, and that general sort of verb discuss. And again, this is probably relevant to short answer sections as well, which we have covered in the
Yeah.
past. But that discuss means to explore an issue, and we see it in each of the modules, so it's present, and these verbs appear constantly. But I think the difficulty that many of our students face is knowing the definition. That's one thing, but then also it's not the same as, I guess, meeting what the verb actually requires in those band
Mhm.
six responses. Because it's one thing to know,
Yeah.
but it's another thing to be able to apply these verbs when it comes to our writing, our written expression, and
Sure.
so on and so forth. So forth. So I think when a question sort of, let's start off with that higher order verb evaluate, because you'll see again in a lot of the HSC papers, at the beginning of each section in each module, you'll see, you will be assessed on, and more often than not, the second verb in the second dot point is often going to be evaluate, to evaluate. Okay, even though it might be like a discuss or an explore and explain type question, you'll see that you will be assessed on your ability to evaluate. So let's start off with that verb here. And this verb evaluate, it's not just asking us to explain how a technique works, which I think
Mm.
many students in general can do. Okay, so they'll know how a technique function, how it works, like what its purpose is, which is a great starting point. Okay, it's a good foundation. Um, but we need to move beyond when it's asking us this in the context of our HSC essay writing. So instead of asking us how to evaluate how the technique just works, it's asking us to make a clear judgment about how successfully a composer constructs meaning. Okay, that's the clear
Mm.
thing. It's making a clear judgment on how successfully. So there's a degree that we sort of need to be looking at. And this is, that make a judgment sort of component that we're talking about here. But it's not just making a judgment on the technique, but how does the composer construct meaning? And this is where we need to
Yeah.
understand the layers of a critical sort of study and the critical essay. So this achieves that particular effect. That's the first part. But then they need to justify that judgment with close reference to the texts. And that is very, very important as well. So very, very close reference
Mm.
to, direct quotes, textual evidence, and so on and so forth. But yeah, like that's probably a good starting point, because when the question says to what extent, it wants a position. Okay, but the position needs to be, I think this is a word, like you need to calibrate your position as to align it with something, right? It's not just a
Mm.
simple yes or no. It's you're aligning it and considering why you've fallen at that sort of calibration along the spectrum. So this needs to be sustained across the entirety of the essay as well, and the entirety of your writing. Um, yeah, like I think when we're considering each module as well, we need to be mindful of what the verb actually entails in each of these. So, for example, the evaluate verb in the critical study will mean that you'll need to evaluate the text, its distinctive features and its nature, solely based on whatever that text is as the focus. However, when we have module A and that textual conversations unit, excuse me, the evaluate or synthesize often requires people to evaluate the conversation between the two texts rather than, um, just make that simple comparison, which is what we see in these textual
Yeah.
conversations units. Um, so yeah, like it's going to be either, that judgment that we need to make on the text distinctive qualities, or maybe the textual integrity. Like these are all terms that you'll see littered throughout uh, the response. But to answer this question in particular, why many responses stay in that effective level is because students will often answer the topic of the question carefully, but they do not answer fully in relation to what the verb is asking them to do. So they'll show an understanding of their prescribed text, they'll organize their ideas clearly, yet their writing remains explanatory rather than evaluative in nature. And I think that's very, very important for us to really
Mm.
grasp. And I'll just say that one more time, because we'll often have really good responses at the high B range, where students will, you know, like I said, we'll say they've ticked all the boxes. This is like that high B sort of
Yes.
verbiage that we speak about. They've ticked all the boxes. They've, made great references to their prescribed text. They've organized their ideas clearly. However, it's more an explanation. It reads more of an explanation of the construction of the text rather than having a judgment. And then this is that little nuance that we look at. So in the HSC, what we're looking at, this will sit in that solid band five territory. It's relevant, it's controlled, it's accurate, but it's not demonstrating that higher order judgment which the markers are looking for. That higher order personal voice, which is
Mhm.
very, very important to move into that top range. So closing that gap, moving from explaining the text to making precise judgments about it is going to be that little shift that our students need to consider. Okay.
Yeah.
This is one of the most important shifts for students who are aiming to move from that band five echelon into that band six echelon that they need to make. And it's something that's continually being crafted, and it's
Mhm.
continually being evaluated. It's something that, and pay attention to that clear word that I mentioned. It's a process of crafting. It's not something that is just one and done. It's something that we need to develop. You need to develop the authentic voice, look at academic perspectives, consider the ways and approaches to text, and the whys and the hows of the specific text that you're asked for. But yeah, that's hopefully answered a little bit of the difference between what leaves a response effective and then what we're
Mm.
looking for when it comes to those highly effective or critical judgments in those band six ranges.
Yeah, I really liked that point you made about when it's kind of a little bit robotic in its nature, the response, kind of like you're addressing the verb from that tick box level, maybe that superficial level, but you're not
Yeah,
actually adapting it to, in English, your specific text and the nuances of your text. Because I think students feel like, oh, well, I know what it means to analyze, and I do it in geography, and I do it in bio, and I do it in
mm,
English. But I think the students that have a lot of success with it is they understand that there needs to be that nuance. So what does,
yeah,
that analyze look like in a biology paragraph or response, versus a PDHPE one and versus an English one, because, each subject area will ask for more nuanced and specific things. And I think those students that are able to understand, like, this is the core verb, but it changes slightly. And then I
yeah,
think the other great point that you made that will probably lead into the next question is that idea of sustaining the key verb. So not
yeah,
just top and tailing it, or popping it in here and there, but making sure that when students are doing their analysis in English, and they've got their body paragraphs and they've got their key points of evidence, that they're also making sure they're hitting the verb in there as well,
yeah.
and that's going to create that sustainment. So yeah, that does lead in then to that second question, like, what is that separation between the effective band 5 evaluation in an English response to that highly effective one in a band 6 paper?
Yeah. So just to recap what I've sort of just mentioned previously is, remember, a solid band five essay does things really well. It'll often do most of it'll tick the boxes. It's one of those terms that we look at. So it presents like a clear thesis. It addresses the question. The evidence from the prescribed text is relevant. Like, you'll see all of
Mm,
these boxes being
yeah,
ticked.
they're visible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the analysis identifies techniques, it explains their meaning, and their structure is often logical. And then the expression is controlled. And students will be like, "How come I'm not getting a band six?" It's one of those
Mm,
sort of things that we probably come across a bit with kids that are
yes.
very mechanical
Yeah.
and methodical in the way, because they might be great math students or science based students, and they'll
Yeah.
often ask like, "What is going on? I've ticked all the boxes. How come I'm still getting
Mm,
that high B?" Um, but when we look at NESA, I think they, for English and the subjective nature of the subject, it means that those responses remain in that effective response. All right, and another way of looking at it is because it's just safe. It just ticks all the boxes.
yeah, I like that. That's a good
You
way of
know,
putting it. It's a
yeah,
safe response.
it's a
It's not
safe
putting
response.
anything new or sophisticated out there. It's just something that you're like, "Yes, I
Yeah,
agree," but it's not giving much
that's
more
right.
of a feel. That's a
That's
good
right.
way of
So what
putting
we
it. Yeah.
yeah, it's probably a nice way. Like, I mean, these types of responses will tend to accept the text concerns at face value,
Mm,
and explain them competently, but they don't push into those more complex judgments and arguments that we'll often see. So let's take Module B for an example, which is a critical study of a text. in advanced English or close study of a text in standard English. All right. And in these types of responses that students might get, they might discuss the textual integrity without really evaluating how the text construction creates that integrity. So yes, they'll evaluate or they'll discuss what textual integrity is, but they don't really evaluate how the text construction creates that integrity because we're looking at the
Yeah.
construction of the text in the
Yeah.
critical study. Um, if we take this lens now to Module A, it might compare the text without fully synthesizing that intertextual implication of their conversation, the conversation that is being had. So when we're looking at like those band six essays, they work at a higher level of evaluation. Okay, so the
Mm.
thesis is more nuanced and often acknowledges complexity or tension. The evidence that is going to be selected is going to be um, very intentional, particularly moments where form and meaning are tightly linked as well. I guess, and it's not
Mhm.
just looking at language; it's moving to the form and the meaning. And this is a great tip for our students if you're wanting to make your analysis seem more in depth. Start to engage with the form and how that lends itself to meaning in a text. I
Yeah.
guarantee you, if a marker sees
Yeah.
that, they're going to be like, okay, this student understands that the conveying of meaning or the reflection of meaning moves far beyond just the language. And this is very significant. So the analysis, what we see is it does not stop at explanation. It starts to question why the composer made particular choices and what those choices reveal about these ideas, values, or the experiences within the text. And remember, this is why our common module is called Text and Human Experiences, because all texts are about reflecting, different sort of forms of human experiences in a way. Let's be honest.
Yes.
You know,
True. Yeah.
uh,
It's that
uh,
the values, those universal values.
yeah,
Yeah. Absolutely.
exactly, exactly. So, when students start to reflect on these choices and they start to question the choices that the composer makes in relation to these ideas, we see the response shift from effective to that highly effective echelon. All right, so now the
Mm.
argument will feel more sustained, and the critical stance is a lot cleaner when it comes to those band six responses. So you can see the difference in the language of judgment. So band five writing often relies on those familiar phrases such as effectively shows or successfully highlights or clearly
Yeah.
demonstrates. Whereas your band six writing is going to tend to use more precise evaluative language. And this might So it's not just about sounding sophisticated for the sake of being verbose, or for its own sake. It's now about showing the kind of critical judgment that the HSC markers will associate with those top band responses. So I think, yeah, that's probably that little separation there that we'll see between those band five and six responses.
Yeah, and I think that last point that you just made really aligns nicely with the third question, which is
Mm.
how can the writers and students deliberately elevate their expression and add value to move into the higher ranges? You just started touching on that. You can continue.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess once students understand the difference in evaluation or these little differences that we've
Mm,
been highlighting, uh, the next step is going to be to build those quality sentences. And it's funny because it starts off
mm.
at just those sentence level parts. One of the things I'll often tell my
Mhm.
students is remember, every sentence is important. Like every single sentence in the
Yes.
body of your essay and even in the introduction has to have some sort of purpose to
Yes.
it, which is
Yes.
a question that you always need to ask, like, how am I supporting the argument that is being had here? How is my
Yeah.
voice being sustained, etc., etc.? So again, we see that process being developed in terms of the writing. It's not just a one and done thing. It's a process of looking, writing, reading, going back, redefining, and then it's the things that we continue to speak about. But it's whether we put that time and effort in. It's whether we put those reps in when it comes to our expression. That's going to be very, very important. But look, stronger HSC writing will use verbs that carry that clear analytical weight. And by this we
Mhm.
mean, many students default to just showing, highlighting, maybe illustrating or presenting, which again, they're great. I love them. They're great band five verbs to use in terms of the strength of the verbs, but these are safe. This is sort of what we're speaking
Mhm.
about, right? They don't delve into that strong judgment which the higher range responses will
Mhm.
often utilize, and they'll be more precise with the verbs when appropriate. Yeah, verbs like synthesize, to dismantle, to interrogate, maybe to expose. These are different words.
Mhm.
Maybe we can look at a few glossaries for teachers, get students to
Yeah.
really develop these higher order verbs and stronger verbs, which they can integrate into the responses. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I guess going back to what I said at the beginning is we need to be practical in our approach to building our sentences. All right, and do these sentences do these three things, or in particular? Do they identify the technique or that compositional choice that the author has made? Do they
Mhm.
evaluate what the composer is doing with it? And are
Yeah.
you linking it to the broader concept, which the question is sort of asking, or the rubric is asking of you? Like those are three key things.
Yeah.
So identify the technique or the compositional choice. Step number one there. Um, Second is evaluate what the composer is doing with it. It's not which is linking it to that broader concept from the question. Okay, so rather than writing, for example, that a composer uses fragmentation to show confusion in a response, a stronger HSC style sentence might explain how that fragmentation disrupts the narrative cohesion and forces the reader to confront maybe something like instability. Um, you start to see this align a little bit better with those band six sort of nuanced responses. So as we move forward, like I said, useful habits include make sure you're checking that evaluative language after drafting and reading. Work aloud to test, that cohesion. So read your work out aloud.
Mhm.
That's probably
Yeah.
step number one. Um, so you can hear your argument that is being made. I think that's very, very important. And this is what the HSC markers will be looking for as well. They're looking not only at your argument, they're looking at how fluid it is, how cohesive it is, and how it's being developed clearly through the body of a response. Okay, what we've probably seen this with a few of our students. Some students will pull out the old thesaurus and be like, "Oh, cool! I'm going to add this word in because it sounds like it's complex, high order
Yes.
vocabulary." All right,
Mm.
but the goal is not to elaborate, your vocabulary and to show the range of your lexicon there in terms of what you're using. It's about how you control your language for purposeful expression. That's very, very
Yeah.
important. And that makes the quality of your evaluation more viable when it comes to your writing. So there's a few significant sort of tips there for our writers to evaluate expression. Hopefully this will be of benefit to both our students and whoever may be listening.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really helpful. I think that, that honing in on that idea of the purpose, because like you said, you can throw out all these big words and these great synonyms, but if ultimately they're not coming back to that verb and what that question wants from you, it does become waffle. And, particularly teachers who are markers, trial markers, HSC markers, they can see right through that. I've had to say that to students before. I say, yeah, cool, but a marker's going to see that and go, but you didn't actually say anything with that. And now you've wasted a sentence or 50
Yeah.
words and you just waffled. So I think it's really important for students not to misunderstand here. It's not just about finding bigger or more complex words, but it's about finding the right ones that are going to help convey your point there and come back to that purpose. So always have that word purpose in mind. I like that a lot, Adriel. Well, then I might ask you one last question then for the use of HSC verbs is, and this is probably much more applicable now for the teachers, how can these higher range skills be taught
Mm.
to students, or even, I guess, practiced effectively as a student so that they have that growth and can get out of that? I keep getting 15 out of 20, 15 out of 20. How can I
Mm.
put something into practice to move into that next level, next mark range?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at these skills again, it's something about development. So we look at develop, it's a practice, isn't it? That has to be put into place, being developed over time. Okay, and when we're looking at it, we need to be focused and intentional in the way that we approach this. Now, this is going. There's no like one size fits all shoe here. It's depending on who your cohort is, who your students are. But I think
Sure.
consistency is probably the word, and then this is going to be the word that we all want to have in our teaching and our practices. We need to be consistent when we do come into some of these writing skills, and I'm guilty of this sometimes when it comes to writing because you want to get through all the content, or students have missed things, and like neglect the skill quickly. Let's get this activity done. Let's get this writing, and we don't spend the time to really hone in on those writing skills. So again, I'm
Mhm.
not preaching here from like a pedestal here to say, look at me. I do no, like I understand the pressures that we have in the classroom, but if we can embed some sort of consistency into the way we look at our writing and writing practices, I think that's going to be one of those effective approaches to developing our responses. And you might start to look at things like rewriting some HSC style questions, sorry,
Yeah.
responses to questions. You might look at some of those booklets which NESA provides and look at what good academic writing looks like. What are the verbs that are being emphasized? Go sentence by sentence, and start to
Yeah.
unpack. Is the judgment directly answering the question? So, like, these are different sort of things where you can pick out and guide the students with these examples. Uh, I think I alluded to this previously, making sure that when we're developing our sentences, we're understanding the verbs and how are you implementing some of these verbs. So before writing, students might restate some of these verbs, just get an understanding again, have that glossary, look over some of those very strong
Mhm.
verbs that are being used. Because it's particularly important for those to what extent evaluate style questions that they'll receive. So when they understand these verbs fully, it'll give them a sense of comfort. They're not going to be overawed by the situation, especially when they're in their assessment or their examination, and they're like, "Oh, what does it mean to analyze or be effective?" Or just continually bombarding them with these things through the course of the term and being consistent again in that approach will definitely be beneficial there. Feedback's always a big thing, so it's most effective when it uses some of the HSC language. So for us as teachers, it's very important. I'm guilty of this as well, but instead of writing something like add more analysis, I guess we need to be a little bit more precise in our comments that we make. So you
Mm.
might be something like, you've explained this technique clearly. Now you need to add a judgment about how successfully it might show or construct or evaluate, blah, blah,
Mm.
blah. Just the wording is going to be important. Another one might be something like the evaluation is still general. Can you make the critical stance more exact in relation to maybe the textual integrity, like how it develops textual integrity?
Mhm.
It might take a little bit longer, but again, these are probably for your more higher order students. If they're putting in the work, you're probably more likely to help them with this. And again, it's tough because I understand we might be looking at 7 or 8 different drafts, you're skipping, over things, and I understand. But it might be something that we work on slowly when it comes to our feedback. I think
Yeah.
the most important thing is to encourage students to develop these skills independently. At the end of the day, it's
Yes.
their HSC. They've got an abundance of resources available to them to look over academic perspectives and writings, and it's up to them at the end of the day. We're there to guide them. They don't rely solely on us. I say as teachers, we put probably 85% of, 15% of the work in, while students will do the 85% because it's your HSC. Okay. And if they build these consistent habits and if you encourage them with building these right structures and processes, it's going to be very, very helpful for them when it comes to their own writing because we're not there to hold their hand in the exam. So they're going to have to fall back on their processes that they've put in. So, yeah, there's a few different, I guess, higher order or higher range of skills that we can work on. Again, it's nothing
Yeah.
new. It's just something that we can look to as teachers to continually
Yeah.
develop. Yeah,
It's just good classroom practice. So you're given a lot of
yeah,
good strategies for things that can be done in the classroom as a whole group, things that can be done when giving feedback. And like if there's one more
Yeah.
thing that I could just add, it's if you want these skills to be taught and absorbed effectively, I think you really need to think about what you do in your programming,
Yeah.
how you set this in your unit of works. Like a lot of schools at the end of year 10 in English will create some sort of transition program for a
Mm.
few weeks. That would be the perfect place to start introducing these HSC verbs, getting them to
Yeah.
start rote learning. Yep, that term one of year 11, getting them to do a little bit of short answer as you're doing that transition to English unit.
Mm.
When you're in your modules, getting students to do little homework writing tasks or little, paragraph responses where you might attach a specific
Yeah.
verb. So I think we sometimes like we do get stressed because we want to do it all once it's assessment
Mm.
time. But really, if you're thoughtful about plotting this along the way, it will really help. Like even I think I like your strategy of just looking at an exemplar intro or body,
Mm.
reading that out loud with your class
Mm.
and getting them to look at each sentence and, well, what is purposeful about each
Yeah.
sentence, which words here are relating, like those modeling things I think are really nice to do early on in the unit and gives kids a perspective of where they kind of should be going. And then it's about how
Yeah.
they do that. So yeah, we're always saying, Adriel, like we're pressed for
Yeah.
time, we know, and you made an excellent one last point too, is that each cohort, each class you have will be different. So the
Mm.
strategies
Mm.
you'll employ will be different. But you also want to think about how you can teach things along around I guess
Yeah.
along a longer scope of time, and therefore not stressing yourself in those 2-3 weeks before the official task is due.
Yeah.
So just some food for thought as well there. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that was really good. You've given a lot of really great key takeaways, so not just which verbs might be really common, particularly in our modules for English, but also looking at what students can do with their use of language
Yeah.
to deepen their perspective on that particular verb and avoid that really superficial checklist layer. And you've
Yeah.
also given some really, really great strategies. So I think listeners will be really happy and thankful for all of your information today, Adriel.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right, we might leave this episode there. Thank you so much for listening to our episode on the language that separates good essays from great ones using HSC verbs in English. And we hope to be in your ears soon next week. And thank you. Bye.
Thank you.